I declare the proposed payments open for examination and refer members to the agency statements, Volume 1. And I can advise the following members have requested to be discharged, being members for Newland, Taylor, Lee and Cheltenham, and have been replaced with the members for Colton, Torrens, Port Adelaide and Wright. Minister, could you please introduce your advisers and make an opening statement if you so wish?
Sir, thank you. On my right is Rick Purse, the Chief Executive of the Department for Education. On my left is Julianne Reedstra, the Chief Operating Officer for the Department for Education. Behind me are Ben Temperley, the Executive Director of System Performance, Carmine Vertere, the Director of Budget and Finance. Chris Bernardi sends his regards from his holiday. Susan Cameron, the Executive Director of Learning Improvement, and Carolyn Crozer-Barlow, the Project Director for the Year 7 to High School project. And there are several other senior executives of the department not too far away if the Shadow Minister or the Opposition has questions on other related matters. I won't do a lengthy opening statement other than to say that it continues to be an absolute privilege and an honour to have this role, and I'm pleased to be able to spend some time this morning in this committee with this group of 7 other MPs. Each one of you 7 are people who regularly contact me about schools and their electorates, so I know that you care about this area very much, not to cast any aspersions on the 4 who have left. This is obviously a very important area of public policy which impacts on both our present well-being and our future prosperity as a state.
Minister, member for Port Adelaide.
Thank you. No, I don't have an opening statement other than to thank the people who've come along today to assist the Minister. So my first question is from Budget Paper 5, page 28. So the budget measures, essentially. I'd like to confirm over both 28 and 29 that the only new money being spent or coming into the department other than for investing purposes, capital purposes, relates to funding for some exemptions for the 457 visa holders that are in regions from having to pay any school fees even if their salary is over the average. Is that correct?
There are a couple of standing items in the understanding between Treasury and the Education Department that determine funding increases. One of them, as the member is aware, is enrolments. There is also the National School Funding Reform Agreement, which was signed late last year, which the member may recall saw us putting an extra $700 million over the next decade into public schooling in terms of the way that that operates. And then there's the measure the members identified, and previously in last year's budget papers obviously there was also further new money in the Year 7 to high school shift, as the funding for a high school student according to our national agreements and our state expectations is based on a higher level than if they're in a high school than in primary school. And in addition to that, obviously, there is also the extra infrastructure spend as well.
Thank you. When it comes to the additional money that comes into the budget for the 21-22 year, for the 22 bit of it for Year 7, because that's when Year 7 starts, does that money include the money that will be provided to the other sectors in South Australia, to the Catholics and the Independents?
It does, but I make the point it's an estimate at this stage, and obviously that the level of that money changes fairly significantly as the proportions of students in each sector change as well. So obviously when there is a significant increase in public school enrolments, the state government is responsible for the overwhelming majority of that funding. When students are in non-government schools, the Commonwealth Government is the overwhelming government funder for those students. And so the mix of that has been varying quite significantly in recent years. And so it's a best estimate at the moment. $40 million per year, I think, was the ongoing cost estimated in last year's budget papers.
44.
It may be more than that.
Understand. So back to page 28. At the top, of course, there's these $48 million in savings that are being anticipated to be delivered, $12 million a year. Can the Minister speak to where that is likely to come from, including the proportion that will come from FTEs and which particular areas within the department might be quarantined from having to deliver a saving to contribute to that $12 million a year?
We're continuing to work through some of the options there. Obviously, salary harvesting is something that has traditionally been a savings measure available to the Education Department and will continue to be so. We wouldn't expect that to be the only measure necessary, but certainly in the past that has been a measure that has been used. I make the point that these are efficiencies in the context of efficiencies that have been applied to the department and continue to be applied to the department from previous budgets. There were some in last year's budget. They're dwarfed by the efficiencies left to us by the former government, particularly the 2017 mid-year budget review. 2017 mid-year budget review cabinet meetings must have been an interesting time for the Shadow Minister, I'm sure, because the former government left us very significant savings, which they thought were reasonable, and it is a large department, and so there are efficiencies that can be made. We're looking, the member asked for examples, so I'm advised that we're looking for procurement efficiencies via contract renegotiations. We've vacated 2 floors in the Education Centre. Some of these things have already happened, some of them are things that may yet happen, and we may be open to looking at other ideas. I don't want to try and suggest that it's just a snap of the fingers and it can be done. But I know that the Shadow Minister has great confidence in us to do this, because she went to the election as the Minister with a much greater savings task that she felt she could make.
To which you've added. So the Learning Improvement Division is having a review at present, I understand. Is it conceivable that that review will aid in making a decision to make savings in learning improvement?
As the review was commissioned on the Chief Executive's direction, I suppose I might invite the Chief Executive to reflect on that.
The review that we commissioned for learning improvement was around making sure that we had the best, most contemporary support for curriculum support. I can absolutely confirm that savings was not an objective of that. We have a draft report in at the moment, which we're considering, and there's a meeting scheduled with the panel of reviewers that will happen in the next couple of weeks. I'd expect that there will be some impacts on the structure and how we organise the Learning Improvement Division, but at this point we're really more talking about what services and support we can provide through Lead 2 schools.
Is the HR support that's provided to principals going to be quarantined from any savings?
I believe I have some information on that. So I can advise this is an important area. This is an area where, of course, principals for a number of years would complain to me and my predecessors as shadow ministers, and I'm sure that that feedback was heard by the member for Port Adelaide as the Minister that the department's support to them in dealing with unsatisfactory performance in school sites or other HR matters wasn't everything that they would have liked it to be. And so there were some reforms undertaken a couple of years ago which have had a fairly significant impact on improving the work the department's done. I think they were nominated for a Public Education Award last year for the support role that they play. And this government values that. So I can advise that the department has provided additional funding to continue and expand support to leaders to manage unsatisfactory performance. The funding will incrementally increase until the end of financial year 2020-2021, according to the advice that I have. And the new funding has allowed existing staff initially funded through the Commonwealth's Independent Public Schools Performance Management Program initiative to continue. It's provided 3 additional staff to date to directly support leaders in the management of unsatisfactory performance and non-compensable health issues. It's enabled existing capacity building programs for school leaders to continue and supported implementation of programs across other sectors, for example, corporate leaders. And it's continued to support a network of trained observers to conduct classroom observations and comment on the teaching skills of those subject to performance management. An additional function regarding the management of minor misconduct has been incorporated into the unit as a result of the department's 2019 restructure, with the transfer of an ASO 5 position from the Incident Management Directorate. That probably answers the member's question.
The program is not in a line within the department for 22-23. Is that what I understand you to say?
No, the funding and the program continues.
Okay,
I'm just advising that there is an increase in funding that is coming up to the 2020-2021 year.
Is the Incident Management Division going to be quarantined from savings?
I'm advised that there have been a couple of positions that have been moved out, or rather one position that's been moved out and 2 positions reduced last year, and that we have no further plans to make any further changes there.
And the last one I'd like to ask specifically about is IT support, given NAPLAN Online's adventures. Is there any, will that be quarantined from savings?
We're very excited about the IT support we're giving our schools as we roll out our fibre optic cable to all of our schools across South Australia. So there is a lot of work for that group to do, in addition to the fibre optic cable to all of our schools and providing support to schools as they move to NAPLAN Online, SACE Online as well. There is also the EMS, the Education Management System, which the member would remember starting the process for. That's a very significant change to IT in our schools and one that is important that we get right. So we are looking at ways of having increased automation and increased efficiency, but I'm advised, I think that what I've just been, I can accurately reflect that there are no plans for any staff cuts in that area.
Alternate, who I know has been waiting patiently and has many questions to ask, I believe.
Very kind of you, Chair. I just have a question for the Minister in regards to Budget Paper 4, Volume 1, page 174. Can the Minister update the committee on the rollout of the improved internet infrastructure for South Australian schools, of course including my electorate, or any specific detail?
Look, I thank the member for the question. It's an important question, as the Shadow Minister actually highlighted just a moment ago, the critical importance of ensuring that our IT in our schools is as good as it can be. And We do know that up until recently we have had the slowest internet connection across our state education system of any mainland state, and that's not good enough. There are too many schools that have been reluctant to engage using the opportunities that the internet provides for pedagogy, for classroom delivery, for professional development, because of course you can only use these in the classroom if you can rely on it to stay on. And when you have situations, as is described to us in too many schools, where a classroom might be using the internet for a project, and then all of a sudden it slows down to become unusable because another classroom next door has turned on the internet as well, that's not good enough. And we know that across Australia, most of other states last year had more than 90% of schools attached to fibre optic cable connections. It's the most reliable, fastest, most scalable form of being able to deliver this service to our schools. And it's critically important, of course, that we reach that standard as well. And up until this project started, we were looking at fewer than 30% of our schools in South Australia with that sort of connection. So we're rolling out the best projects across South Australia. I'm pleased to say that we're well on the way to doing that. As of today, I'm advised we're ahead of schedule with 163 sites now connected to the new high-speed fibre service. That's more than 92,000 students and 10,000 educators in schools that have had the service connected. I'm advised that in the members' electorate of Colton, he'll be pleased to know he's already aware that the Fulham North Primary School had the cable laid on the 25th of February, the Fulham Gardens Primary School on the 7th of May. This month, the cable's been laid to the Henley High School and indeed the West Beach Primary School on the 17th of July. In the coming weeks, the Kidman Park Primary School is scheduled to be connected in week 4 of term 3. The St Leonard's Primary School is scheduled in week 9 of term 3, and Henley Beach Primary School is to be connected in term 4. This is important for our public education system. I'm also pleased to advise that we've enabled connections between Telstra and independent schools, and I understand that a number of independent schools are also in discussion to access some of this infrastructure. Particularly, it'll be important in country communities, many of whom don't have such infrastructure at the moment, and it will enable Telstra to offer packages to customers in those communities, business, potentially personal customers in the future, at a much higher quality than they've had before. And we're also glad that other government departments, including potentially hospitals and courts, will benefit from rapidly improved internet speeds. Some schools have reported, one IT teacher at Ardrossan Primary School, I think, it was, who reported that the speed since connection is about 2,000 times faster than what they were experiencing before. We were saying that we were promised it would be up to 1,000 times faster, so that's good. The speeds will be different in different schools across the state, and we remain committed for the 4 schools, which are regional and remote schools, Kangaroo Island, Lee Creek, Marie and Oak Valley, that they will not have the cable, but will Telstra has committed to making best efforts to get them an exceptional service as well, and we'll, in the near future, we hope to finalise what that service will look like.
Adelaide.
Thank you. I'd now like to turn to budget paper 4, volume 1. And page 168. On the second dot point, see a number of priorities that the government has, and languages are mentioned. That prompts me to ask about the arrangements for the ethnic schools, or ethnic and community languages schools, that are housed in public high schools and primary schools at present. Specifically, I'm aware that the Greek school, the Port Adelaide Greek School, is being kicked out of Seaton heading into the second half of the year, when they have some students undertaking SACE, as I understand it. So I'd like a specific answer on what kind of assistance is being provided to that school, but more specifically, given the amount of works occurring in schools, whether there is disruption to other ethnic and community languages schools.
Well, the member would be aware, because it's something that she occasionally might have had approaches from me about when I was the Shadow Minister, and I know that it's an area that both of us have high regard for the ethnic schools and the work that they do. I was very pleased in the last 12 months to sign off on an increase to the per capita funding for ethnic schools of, I think it was $5 a student, and that was something we were very pleased to be able to do. We'll double-check that on the detail. The member has written to me about the Greek school, and it's something that I have spoken to Daryl Buchanan about as the head of the person who manages our ethnic schools program, and he, on behalf of the department and on behalf of the school, is working with some potential local institutions to assist the Greek school. We've got a couple of leads. I don't think that they've been finalised yet, so I wouldn't want to put them on the hook in estimates when those discussions are taking place, but I am hopeful that we can resolve the situation for the Greek school to minimise disruption to students. This isn't something that's new. This is something that can be a challenge for ethnic schools from time to time. Many of them are located as guests of our Department for Education schools. Some of them have their own facilities. Some of them operate out of community facilities. Some of them operate out of non-government schools as well. And while the need that they have is for some classroom space effectively, they do, as a general rule, like to have their own space. Some of them have their own rooms connected to churches, for example. They do like to have their own space so that they can store their material and have a sense of ownership. And in some cases that's possible and it's done really well. In some cases it's quite challenging. So from the Education Department's point of view, we certainly see the value of the ethnic schools. They have a ongoing level of support from the department. We're working with the ethnic schools to increase their capacity to deliver SACE courses, and where possible. Not all of them are in a position to do that. Some of them are more focused on the early primary years. But where possible, we'd like students to be able to access SACE language courses, and where ethnic schools can help us in delivering that, that's a great benefit. We'll continue to work with all of our ethnic schools where we can to provide them support, but it's to be acknowledged. I think the member mentioned Seton High School. I think that the term kicked out is, I mean, it's a bit emotive. Seton High School's in a position, obviously, where they've got their needs as well to their students, and it's entirely reasonable that Seton High School are able to make decisions that relate to the best use of their facilities. But in that context, we want to work with the ethnic school to help them get a good outcome, and I hope that'll be the case.
Given the works that are being undertaken through Building Better Schools, moving Year 7 and the completion of STEM, I wonder if the Minister would take on notice where there's an anticipation that there might be issues caused for ethnic schools. That's the case in Seton. The $20 million that the previous government indicated they would have is now going to be spent, which is excellent for Seton, but it has had a knock-on effect. It would be useful to have some advance warning about where that's going to occur elsewhere, and if that could be identified, I'd appreciate it, but I expect you don't have it with you now.
Let me check. What I can say is that there will be, I'm fairly certain in the annual report, if nowhere else, a list of our ethnic schools, and I'm hoping that that will include a list of their locations. I believe that's a publicly available document, and I'll check if it's not. And then marrying up that document with where there are infrastructure projects is something that any member of the public can do, because again there is a list. The caveat I'd put on that, of course, is that there's some of those projects are happening sooner rather than later, so if there is some further additional information that would be of benefit to the member, then I'll get back to her, but I suspect that most of it is publicly available.
Okay, so if it's not publicly available, you'll bring it back to me, and otherwise I can go on an FOI journey. I would also like to ask about the VET, the reference to VET in that third dot point, and ask what changes have occurred thus far on the way in which vocational education and training is treated in secondary schools from what had previously occurred, say, the year before or the year before that.
Well, I know that there is a substantial review out at the moment, and I encourage the member to keep that in mind, because I think that will have the opportunity to substantially improve not just the quality of vet service provision, but also the status of vocational education and training. One of our significant opportunities, I think, in this space is to ensure that our teachers, our families, our schools, our students and our community more broadly has a stronger understanding of the significant benefits of vet education, traineeships, apprenticeships. The discussion paper that went out with the review contains a good deal of information that I'd encourage all members to read, all members of the community as well as all members of this committee. In terms of the dot point talks about vet pathways to employment for young people in secondary schools. And I'd say that that's certainly impacted by the $200 million Skilling South Australia Fund, which is aimed at delivering 20,000 new traineeships and apprenticeships. We are encouraged through our flexible apprenticeship pilot at the moment that will encourage more young people into apprenticeships or indeed traineeships as well. And can I say that the Fresh Start for TAFE SA, the higher level of confidence that the community sees in TAFE SA as a result of the work that the government has done with it, the significant new investment in TAFE SA, with more than $100 million reinvested in TAFE SA over and above what was in the budget left to us by those opposite. That's significant too, because I think people do need to have confidence in our major public training provider, which of course is also the major auspicing provider for vet qualifications in our schools. Is that sufficient, or would you like me to?
It is indeed. When will the Technical College be announced? I think several schools involved in hoping to be awarded the contract felt that it was going to be by Easter.
I thank the member for the question, and obviously there's been a range of people involved and several schools and other bodies involved in putting forward suggestions. Due diligence is currently being finalised according to my advice, so I would anticipate that further announcements wouldn't be too far away.
When does the Minister expect the Technical College to be functional, so to be operating with students?
I think that the best way for me to answer that is to suggest that with the announcements that aren't too far away, we'll provide as much information as possible at that time. I could take it on notice, but I suggest that the information will be all publicly available soon enough.
Okay. If we turn to the next page, 169, which is the list of some of the capital works that are occurring in our schools. Can the Minister, and I'm very happy for this to be taken on notice because it's a level of detail, can the Minister say which of these schools on the list will require additional space for Year 7?
Well, I think most of them, not all. Well, I think most of them, because obviously there's a priority that we're placing on ensuring that all of those that do require additional space for Year 7s are done by the beginning of the 2022 school year. Of the ones on that list, I will come back to the member. Hang on a second. I'm advised that information is actually on the website, broken down by school as to which ones require additional capacity.
Okay. And how much, and again I'm happy for this to be taken on notice, how much will be spent on general learning areas for each of these schools?
My understanding is that the scope of these projects is a matter that's worked out between each individual school. The money is a combination of general learning areas, specialist learning areas. Some of them are providing other facilities as well. And I think that it's worth noting that a number of these projects are to have significant increased capacity, not just to enable more Year 7s to be able to attend these schools, but also to substantially enhance the capacity to enrol students in other year levels too. I think of Nord Morialta High School, for example. Obviously there's a question there because the campus that is being expanded currently hosts, I think, fewer than 700 students. And so that expansion will enable it to host Year 7s, Year 8s, Year 9s and Year 10s who are currently not on that campus. If I'm looking at another one of the schools, the Glossop High School is another one where campuses are coming together, so multiple year levels are being supported. There's a range of schools where the number of extra spaces is substantially over and above just the Year 7 contingent coming in, and it's worth noting as well that if we weren't doing the Year 7 move, a large number of our primary schools would need substantial extra infrastructure. The fact is that there are, I think it was in the order of 20,000 extra students coming into our public school system in the next 3 years, and certainly into our high schools, I think. Yeah, 20,000 extra into our high schools. Now, I believe that a little over half of that is Year 7s, but there are expanding pressures on our public school system. More than half is Year 7s, to be sure, but not just the Year 7s.
Nonetheless, I would appreciate for each of these a breakdown of what's for general learning and what's for specialised learning areas.
Well, we'll be announcing the scopes of the projects as they become confirmed.
And I'd also like to know how many of these will require additional staff, space or facilities.
I'm advised that'll be in the scope of the projects when it comes on, but it's fair to say that there are extra staff that come along with extra students.
And when do you anticipate having those scopes completed so that I can have access to that information?
It's a rolling program. I can't tell the member when the first one will be rolled out at the moment, but I'll endeavour to provide some information on our best estimate of that.
I note that Seaview High School isn't on the list, so presume it's not spending any money in the 1920 budget. But I understand it is having money provided as part of the additional funding for Year 7, which is mentioned on page 168, the 185 million. Seaview's half full at the moment, and I'm wondering what it was that prompted the need to spend money on Seaview, given that it's only half its capacity at present.
So Seaview has a rapidly growing student population. I think that there is also a significant increase in the proportion of parents who live in the Seaview zone who are choosing it as their school of choice. Actually, I recall getting a letter from a parent who was in the Brighton High School zone not that long ago, asking that they be allowed to have their child go to Seaview because they were very confident in the work that's there. I believe that Seaview has a $9 million project. We can, I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, but also it is one of the schools, and I think there's about 10 of them, that will benefit from a share in the $56 million that was announced where we're not tying the money figure to the school. We're saying that it will get a certain number of increased places, and we believe that that'll cost $56 million with a little bit of flex between the schools. So we actually do believe that Seaview, while it has some room at the moment, it is rapidly filling to fill that room and will need extra capacity. And the reason that it's not listed specifically here is because it's in the other school projects, which has schools that have less than $10 million identified for the total project cost, and of which $51 million is being spent in the 2019-20 year.
Thank you. With Brighton High, I read in the material that was provided to the advertiser that I think there were 100 net additional students as a result of Year 7, although I've subsequently, I think, seen 150. But either way, you're welcome to clarify that if you like, but either way, why does it need nearly $14 million?
Well, Brighton High, I think there'll be more than 100 Year 7s, but the expansion in capacity is 100. I believe that we are, and Carolyn will correct me if I'm mistaken, I think we are reducing the number of international students that they're allowed to take as well, and obviously they'll be enforcing their zone potentially more rigorously than they have in the past, while being able to maintain specialist programs at the school. So I think that goes some way to clearing up some of the confusion about the 100 figure. There is in fact, there are going to be 300 students in each year level at Brighton. And in terms of the built capacity at the school, we're looking to build to 1,800. Now, it's possible that the school is using some innovative ways to fit some students in at the moment. Sorry? Timetabling and so forth. But the other point is that some schools are more expensive to build extra capacity than other schools. Brighton High is one where, unless we want to build new buildings over their ovals, the footprint where the classrooms and the performing arts spaces and the buildings are requires a more complex build than those where that have footprints for easier builds.
So do you anticipate that $14 million being spent on general learning areas then for the extra 100 students?
So my understanding is that the approach taken in relation to all of these is that it would be a mix of general learning areas, specialist learning areas, potentially car parks and other things that are necessary. The member mentioned staff spaces before as one of the potential requirements, and that may well be the mix here. Each of the schools will end up with a different mix depending on their local needs. It may well be that those mixes are exactly in the proportions the same as each other, but we're not operating on a one-size-fits-all model. We're operating on the idea that we will get a project that will be suitable for each of those schools. And when we have that detail at Brighton, I'm sure that we'll be happy to release it.
So I understand the reason that it looks like only 100 additional students. Very nice to have $14 million spent on 100 kids. I wish we could do that everywhere. So the reason that the anticipation of increase is only 100 is because there are a number of students who are from out of zone who go to Brighton High, not just because of specialist music, but more generally. Has the agency done any work on where the kids who are coming currently, obviously they won't be thrown out, but their successor students won't be able to go to that school anymore if you're going to manage the increase of a whole year level to only being 100 kids. So which schools will those students then be required to go to? Where are they zoned for currently, but at the moment they're managing to go to Brighton High?
I think the
so
member
Seaview
is...
will be one, but I'm wondering if there are others.
Well, I mean, it's a hypothetical question because every year it would be a different answer depending on the cohort of the families involved and depending on the schools that they're attracted to. So, I mean, there would be historical stories about which schools kids have been to, which school zones they're choosing not to attend, and you know, there's been that choice and flexibility in the past. Some of those schools that kids are now choosing to go to are very attractive, and we just spent some time talking about Seaview. I suspect Seaview would be the one that with the largest number of students traditionally that would be going to Brighton, but there would also be schools from all around the metropolitan area which would have students in zone who are going to Brighton through one of their specialist programs. I think they've got volleyball and music. There may well be others. The Brighton Secondary School was the winners of the World Formula One in Schools competition last year, and I think that that was a tremendous result. And I thank Corey Wingard, one of the parents at the school and local MP, who helped them in their fundraising.
So will you take on notice where students who are not in zone and not in a specialist program are residing at present for historical comparison purposes?
I will see what we can get, bearing in mind that the question you're asking is about what are the, to be clear, you're asking what are the geographical locations of students at the moment. Mm-hmm. And I make the further point that once a student is enrolled at a school, we don't force them to leave the school if they move.
Accept that.
So the question the member is asking is in relation to what school would they have been zoned to when they were in year 8, because after that they're not, it's no longer relevant. So we'll definitely get the year 8s for the ones who are in year 8 this year, and we'll see if there's anything else that's relevant.
Seeking the call.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question originating from Budget Paper 4, Volume 1, page 174, under the heading Highlights, about the 4th dot point down. And I wonder whether the Minister might update the Committee on the Phonics Screening Check project.
I thank the member for the question. It's a very important question, and it's something that everyone in the room can be proud of, that South Australia is leading the nation in this work. The phonics screening check is one important element of the government's literacy guarantee policy, which we took to the election. It's not a silver bullet that's going to solve all of our problems, but it's a very important and useful tool to help teachers in classrooms, to help us focus our system on the things that are going to get our kids to be able to have the best chance of being able to read, which is so important to their later development in life and in education. Children, of course, start school with a wide range of knowledge, skills and understandings relating to reading. A good grasp of phonics, we know, is an essential skill that students require when learning to read and write. It's something that is helpful for some students and absolutely essential for others, and this is particularly of concern to families of students with dyslexia and other learning difficulties, and we know that the best way to teach those students to read is through ensuring they have a strong grasp of phonics, and it's helpful for all students. So the phonics screening check is designed to ensure that all of our students do acquire that strong foundation in the essential aspects of literacy. Teachers will analyse the results of the phonics screening check, and they plan specific interventions for those students who are seen to need it based on their performance during the check. And and it's important this is done in year 1. One of the challenges is, of course, that the reading that some students do in the early years is based on a lot of repetition, pictures giving clues to the words on the page, and so a lot of smart kids who are struggling with their reading are able to appear as if they're doing well in their reading through guessing or sheer memory of how some words look. But phonics is the thing that gives the key, that gives them the opportunity to decode what those words look like, so that when they encounter a word they haven't seen before, a more complex word, then it helps them to be able to decode what that word is, and they can say it out loud and then be able to recognise it. And the check helps us to identify those kids. Particularly, I think one of the things that I found interesting through the rollout of the check is a lot of teachers and a number of principals were sceptical about it. Some welcomed it, and pretty much everybody that I've spoken to has found it to be a better experience than they thought. Some thought that it was going to be great and found it to be great. Some were sceptical and found it to be pretty useful. The research that went into the trial that was undertaken when the Shadow Minister for Education was the Minister in 2017, it was trialled in 50 schools in reception year 1. and Anne Bayeto and her team at Flinders University did some research. They found that it was useful, it was welcomed by teachers and the students. They enjoyed the one-on-one time, and the program was worthwhile, particularly for Year 1s, which is why we've rolled it out for those Year 1s. So, in 2018, 13,817 Year 1 students actively participated in the screening check from 432 schools. Schools were supported with TRT days, one for the professional development of principals and teachers who are administering the check, one for the check to be able to actually be administered in classes so that the teacher would have that one-on-one time without having to juggle it with other duties at the same time, and one to enable the teachers to be able to plan interventions for students as necessary. 5,951 of our Year 1 students, or 43%, showed that they met the expected achievement by correctly decoding 28 words or more out of 40. And we'd like to see that improve in the years ahead. But the good news is that when this was undertaken in the UK, over a series of years, the phonics screening check outcomes saw significant improvement over that time as teachers became more and more familiar with how to integrate teaching of phonics into the work that they're doing. A lot of teachers went to uni when phonics wasn't even part of the teacher training course at university, and that's increasingly becoming an important part of what our universities are offering. So we do expect to see improvement in the years ahead. We certainly hope that will be the case. In 2019, the phonics screening check will be implemented with every Year 1 student in a government school during Term 3 over a period of 4 weeks in August. And face-to-face professional learning for more than 1,400 Year 1 teachers is currently underway and will continue into early Term 3. For teachers who haven't administered the check, they'll obviously have the opportunity to participate in that introductory course. For teachers who have done it before, we're looking at more advanced PD opportunities for them so that they find it useful. Schools are receiving release time to support Year 1 teachers to attend that professional learning face-to-face, to administer the screening check and to respond to the results. And as we did last year, in 2019, the phonics screening check materials will again be made available to other schooling sectors for their potential use. Schools are also being supported with online materials to guide them in interpreting students' performance on the phonics screening check and responding with appropriate interventions. These materials have been developed in consultation with the Australian Council for Educational Research. South Australia, as I said, is leading the nation. I'm grateful to the support from the opposition for doing this. I'm grateful to the work that the member for Port Adelaide did as the Minister for Education in staring down the opponents of the phonics screening check and ensuring that a trial was available to be taken place, which I think is positioning our system, our schools and most importantly our children well for the future.
Call.
Minister, I refer to Budget Paper 4, Volume 1, page 175, about departmental music, and ask the Minister to report on the effectiveness and success of changes to music in schools to date, and as part of the new music education strategy, have any gaps been identified for improvement?
I'm happy to talk in general about the music education strategy. The specific questions I heard from the member were to do with new initiatives and whether any gaps have been identified. Is that
so are the new initiatives part of a new push or looking to support any gaps that have been identified in music since the changes were made?
So there were, because there's several iterations of this, and obviously music in our schools is supported on a number of levels. Some schools choose to have a music teacher. There is a significant instrumental music service which operates in a number of schools. I think with a large number of staff, and they support group work in music and ensembles and bands and I think more individual work in the senior years. Then there are also schools that make the decision to take on hourly paid instructors, and there are also schools that allow private music instructors to come into the school. All of that work is historical. There were some changes to the way that music-focused schools were organised in the last couple of years of the former government, and And that structure that was put in place several years ago continues at the moment. And in addition to that, we have the new music education strategy, which is providing some further opportunities for schools. And maybe if I can outline some of the broad things that are in the new music education strategy, happy to go into further detail as needed or take detailed questions on notice. So the music education strategy was released in November 2018. It's a 10-year aspiration, 2019 to 2029, with a focus on ensuring that all children and young people in South Australia have access to quality music education. And particularly, I think the member asked about gaps. One of the things we were concerned about is that the list of different ways in which music is made available as part of education for our schools, whether that's having a music teacher dedicated, having engagement with the instrumental music service, hourly paid instructors or private music instructors. There are schools in South Australia that don't have any of those opportunities, and their students we would like to see have the opportunity to have music education as part of their education going through school. That's something that we believe we need to do to ensure every school is given the benefit and the opportunity to fulfil their potential. The strategy has $7 million of targeted investment over the coming 4 years to enhance existing systems, build capacity, provide better support for general classroom music education. That's particularly important in those schools, particularly small schools, maybe remote schools that don't have a music teacher. We're looking to upskill non-specialist teachers and educators to improve the delivery of general classroom music education and provide curriculum and pedagogy resources with a particular focus on primary schools. Since the launch of the strategy, the Department has developed, refined and progressed the implementation plan for the strategy, with the rollout of the initiatives being phased over the 4-year funding cycle. Mr Nick Birch, who was the Assistant Principal, he certainly was. I think he's now started his new role. He was the Assistant Principal or the Head of Music from Playford International College, which is one of our schools with a great reputation for music. He's been recruited as a dedicated manager following a nationwide search, and I think it's to the credit of music educators here in South Australia that that nationwide search found the best person for the job right here in South Australia and indeed
I'm not surprised.
in the public education system. And I think the member for Florey's comfort and confidence in that is absolutely justified. So Nick's had more than 13 years of professional music education experience, as well as demonstrated leadership in strategic planning and implementation of various music programs and initiatives. A music education strategy advisory panel has been established to provide strategic advice and direction to the department regarding the implementation of strategy initiatives. Many of these people, of course, helped us in the development of the initial strategy. We're privileged to have a cross-section of internal and external music and education leaders, including Dr Anita Collins, who's a neuromusical educator, Professor Graham Kerner, AO, Director of the Elder Conservatorium, Mr Vince Ciccarello, the Managing Director of the Symphony Orchestra, Dr Jenny Rosevier, AM, who's a Visiting Research Fellow at the Elder Conservatorium, and she is the representative nominated by the Australian Society for Music Education South Australian Chapter. So in the coming financial year, we're expecting to spend nearly $3 million to improve the delivery of music education through 2 funding rounds of the Music Innovation Fund. I think the first one of those closed a couple of weeks ago, so we'll be looking to make announcements in the not-too-distant future about that first group of grants under that fund. We've got 4 music education experts working with a networks of schools and preschools, and they're developing, supporting and embedding the vision, goals and initiatives of the strategy into classroom and discipline-specific music education, and also wider communities awareness. I think one of the things that's really valuable here, as I spoke about VET earlier, I think it's also important that for music education, it's important that families and communities have an understanding of the benefits to students of having music education. We know that it benefits their broader academic development as well as the if they want to be a musician, that's great, but if they want to be any other number of things in life, having a strong sense of music in their education helps them in that too. The $3 million is also going towards development of music teaching and learning resources, so we're looking forward to having them completed and being able to be released, and to providing some new professional development opportunities in music education for teachers. So I could go on, I won't. Only to mention, I suspect that the member has asked previously about IMS staff levels.
I was just going to ask you, have there been any staff losses in the IMS branch?
Well, I can provide information as it happens. The instrumental music budget comprises of 84.5 FTE staff, including leaders, teachers and administration staff. Within that 84.5 FTE, there's provision for 10.4 FTE leadership and administration staff and 74.1 FTE instrumental music teachers. That number can vary throughout the year. The total instrumental music budget for 2019-20 is $11,749,000. And
next question would be, how are you measuring the standard of quality of music instruction in the schools? I mean, there's a wide variance that I've observed locally of people coming into the schools. I just want to know how you're measuring it and what the outcome of that is.
We don't have a NAPLAN standardised test for music, obviously, and I don't think that the member is suggesting that or anything else. The member asks about the quality of music instruction, and the member's said, and she's suggested to me recently, that she would like it to be at the highest level possible for all of our schools and all of our students. And observing performances, you may see a different performance in some schools to other schools.
I certainly do.
Do we have a formalised measure of that with assessors going out and checking that? We don't. I certainly hear feedback from the member and other members of Parliament who have mostly really positive things to say about their schools, and you know, it's something where Mr. Birch, one of the things we would like him to do is to work with schools as he's going around the state to ensure that standards are appropriate, and I hope that that will actually see an uplift in our whole system. But in terms of a formalised measure, I can't point to one.
At least you've turned your mind, the department's turned its mind to it, which is useful.
And it's something that the member has brought to my attention, and I think very fairly so.
And my last question is, it may be slightly off field, but it's page 176, 177 of Budget Paper 4, Volume 1. What work is being done to identify Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students well in advance to years 11 and 12 for assistance into scholarships for further education? And does a program that used to exist for teaching scholarships still exist? And if so, how many students have successfully completed their Bachelor of Education through that program?
Sorry, just give me a moment.
Sure. Could be good for me to mention here that Muriel Matters studied music. Muriel Matters studied music at the Conservatory.
Muriel Matters was a trailblazer in so many ways.
Yes.
Budget papers are therefore...
Oh my goodness. I was just filling in a moment. But, somebody else is doing that for me now.
There are a number of measures being taken under the Aboriginal Education Strategy, which we announced last year, and there's a number of measures being undertaken in our schools already. Identifying students, perhaps I can just reflect on some of the strategies, and some of them may fit in exactly to the question that the member asked, and some of them might be slightly broader, but I indicate that the SASTA is obviously an ongoing program that was established well over a decade ago now, and continues to be expanded. We have changed its name from the South Australian Aboriginal Sports Training Academy to Secondary Training Academy at the request of people in SASTA, to reflect the fact that it's not just about sports, it does other work as well. And that body obviously does work in identifying and supporting students to achieve their role. This year we have seen the Clontarf Foundation academies start to do their work in sites in Whyalla, Port Augusta, Port Lincoln and at Ocean View College, supporting 6 schools in those 4 academies. And they're particularly focused on getting young Aboriginal boys and young men re-engaged with education. The students in question are ones who were disengaging, many of whose attendance was minimal, less than 50%, maybe up to 60 or 70%, but students who are really at risk. And what we're seeing through those programs, they're getting them to school, they're giving them meaningful things to do, they're using football as an incentive, but it's also a lot about life skills. And the 2 academies that I've visited at Ocean View College and at Port Augusta Secondary School, they have this board of attendance there which shows each week how much the kids are coming, and they spur each other on to get that 100%, which the majority of those kids are now getting. And those kids are doing well at school now and hopefully will engage in further study. Scholarships. This is for teachers. So scholarships for teachers is under the Amy Levi scholarships, and that still exists, but I'm going to have to take on notice the numbers and completion rates for that.
That'd be great.
And further scholarship initiatives, I know that there's, we've received some contact from Michael O'Loughlin, I think it's the Go Foundation. Michael O'Loughlin and Adam Goods have engaged with a couple of our schools in the north, and the first cohort of students getting those scholarships, I believe, are getting scholarships this year. That's scholarships to support the kids while they're at school. And if there's any way that we can enhance that program, we will, and there are other supports throughout the Aboriginal education strategy.
Thank you.
Minister, Budget Paper 4, Volume 1, page 169. How much of the $12 million which is allocated to Golden Grove High School will be spent on new classrooms to accommodate the transition of Year 7 into high school?
I thank the member for the question. I'll have to take that on. Well, I'll take it on notice and see what we can provide in the short term. But obviously, as I said to the Shadow Minister earlier, when the scope of these projects is finalised and the details are finalised, that detail will be released as well. But for the purposes of the committee, I'll take it on notice and we'll provide back what we can.
So same budget line, Budget Paper 4, Volume 1, page 169. When does the government anticipate that Year 7s will be on the Golden Grove High School campus?
Well, they'll be starting as students at Golden Grove High School on Term 1 2022, I would have thought. Yeah, well, it is. It is. Obviously, there'll be students that will engage with the high school, as I suspect they probably already do from time to time, and but it's Term 1 2022 when there'll be students at Golden Grove High School in Year 7.
So when would construction need to begin on additional classrooms to make sure those Year 7 students have classrooms when they move to the site?
As we finalise the scope of it.
The detail will be in the scope, which, as we say, hasn't come out yet, but I make the point, because there are a large number of these, we're not eager to have every single one of them at the same stage of progress at exactly the same time across all of these schools, because of course there's a body of work and there's a certain number of people in the industry in South Australia who are able to do the work. So the staging will be taking place throughout the rest of 2019, through 2020 and through 2021. The advice that I've received is that the completion will be before the end of 2021. But you'll notice that all of the lines on page 169 in relation to these schools, with one or two exceptions, do say December 2021. I think that it's fairly reasonable to say that I'm hoping that some of them will be completed substantially before then, and the staging within that will be worked through is being worked through.
Same budget line again, Minister. What does the government anticipate the increase in enrolments at Golden Grove High School will be, taking into account Year 7 moving to that school?
I believe that it's publicly available, but to assist the committee and the member, the increase in Golden Grove is expected to be 400, of which the overwhelming majority, or 380 of them, are Year 7s.
Okay, thank you. And same budget line and same question, but this time for Brighton Secondary School.
Sorry, what was the question?
What is the increase in school enrolments based on Year 7 transitioning at that site?
Well, if it assists, the February 2018 enrolments at Brighton Secondary School were 1,693, and we're seeking to build the capacity to 1,800. Now, it's possible, as I said before, that the Brighton Secondary School are managing that current enrolment, through timetabling opportunities and fitting students in over capacity. Obviously, we prefer there to be capacity for the students that are going in.
So, same budget line again, Minister. Am I right then in saying that, roughly speaking, the increase at Golden Grove High School is somewhere in the vicinity of 400, 380 of which are Year 7 students, and the increase at Brighton Secondary School is 100 due to the transition from Year 7 into high school?
Well, they're not necessarily apples with apples, but the increase in capacity at Brighton Secondary that we're looking at is 100. And Brighton Secondary, we're also taking other steps, as I outlined before, including limiting the number of international students, which I think will see quite a bit of a decline in the numbers of international students at Brighton Secondary. And Brighton Secondary has already, I think, in the last couple of years, tightened up on the way that they're enforcing their zone. So it's not necessarily apples with apples there, but it is correct to say that we're increasing capacity at Golden Grove High School by 400, of whom 380 of them are the Year 7s.
So same budget line again. Is it not true then that Golden Grove High School, given take into account the $10 million that was given by the previous government under Building Better Schools, plus I think a top-up of somewhere in the vicinity of $5.5 million, gives about $15.5 million in disposal for Golden Grove High School, and Brighton Secondary School has about $13.8 million available to it. How do you rationalise those two figures, given that one school seems to be having an increased capacity of 100, the other school is having an increased capacity of 400, and Golden Grove High School is every bit as landlocked in terms of its capacity to develop out as Brighton Secondary School?
Well, the member is making a number of assumptions in that question. The first point is his expert opinion that Golden Grove High School is every bit as landlocked as Brighton Secondary School. That's not the advice that I've received from the Education Department in terms of the complexity of what a build would be. The second point I make is that the facilities that are being constructed, while the increase in capacity might be largely tied to the numbers of Year 7s coming in, the facilities that are being constructed include a mix with specialist learning areas and, as I said before, other infrastructure that will be used by staff, be used by students from Years 8, Year 9, Year 10, Year 11, Year 12 as well as the general learning areas occupied by the Year 7s. So when the scope comes out and the detailed plans come out, the member's welcome to reflect on those and make the assertions. He can make the assertions now if he likes, but I fear that the advice I've had from the Education Department does not marry with what the member for Wright has asserted.
Same budget line. What advice have you received from the department about the capacity of Golden Grove High School to expand compared, say, with Brighton Secondary School?
Look, the advice I've received simply summarised as the Golden Grove High School build can be done for the budget outline. Now, I note that the member, I think, said $15.5 million. So there's a $12 million that's been identified in as clearly for Golden Grove, and then there's the share of the $56 million that was identified before, and it's a reasonable estimate to say that that would be about $3.5 million. It may be a bit more, it may be a bit less going there. But that $56 million part of the announcement for the Year 7 to High School project is based on a number of students that are going to be going to these schools, not a dollar figure necessarily. So it's a reasonable anticipation that 3.5 of that $56 million can be added to the $12 million existing at Golden Grove. And so 15.5 is certainly going to be within the ballpark. It could be a bit more, it could be a bit less. And we will build the facilities needed. The advice I've had from the department is that that is what is going to be necessary to enhance the facilities and provide the necessary capacity for Golden Grove High School.
Same budget line, Minister. So has any specific sites been identified at Golden Grove High School for where those new classrooms might go?
I don't have that information. I believe that it would be publicly released when the scope comes out, and if we've got any... Sorry, I've just got a frog in my throat. I don't have that information. I believe it'll be publicly released when the scope comes out.
Same budget line, the Heights School in Modbury Heights, from my reading of the budget papers, there's no extra money for them in the budget. So how much of the $10 million that was allocated under the Building Better Schools Fund is going to be spent at that school on extra classrooms for Year 7 students?
It'll depend on the scope, which will be announced in due course, but it's not expected to be dramatic, is my understanding.
Same budget line, Minister. Banksia Park International School, same situation, I believe, as the Heights School. No new money in this budget for them to be able to accommodate Year 7s who will move on to their site. How much of the $9 million, I think, that was given under the previous government for Building Better Schools will be redirected to accommodate Year 7s moving on to that site?
I think you get the same answer as for the previous questions of the same nature.
Could I ask on page 175, please, of Budget Paper 4, Volume 1, at targets, dot point number 3, pilots into Year 7 to High School in Mitcham Girls John Perrion Secondary School and Wirianda. Can you provide a bit of an update to the committee on how that is rolling out?
I'm really pleased to, actually, and I think that the principals at those three schools have indicated that they're very excited and their school communities are very excited about how it's rolling out. The Chair would be aware that one of those schools is in his electorate at Mitcham Girls High School.
Yes.
It's a remarkable coincidence. There were more than 160 expressions of interest from students currently in Year 6 families of students currently in Year 6 who wish to undertake Year 7 there, and the principal there is very excited. There are nearly 100 students at John Perry Secondary School whose families indicate an interest there, and at Wirianda it was more than 100. Can I say, to make these pilots work, we would have needed several dozen students and their families to indicate an interest in having the opportunity to do Year 7 in high school next year. To have well over 300 families at the 3 schools do it exceeded our hopes, and but doesn't exceed the capacities of those schools. So those schools are preparing well. They're working with their local primary schools, and we're grateful to the assistance of our staff who are helping to make this work as well. There is an opportunity for some of the local primary schools to have a look at the way that Year 6s and 7s who are leaving their primary schools at the same time can graduate together, that some of the lessons from how they do that will be useful lessons for the end of 2021 when this is replicated across the state. And obviously with 2 classes, the Year 7s and the 8s, both integrating into a new school at the same time, that is something that is new for these pilot schools that will have lots of important lessons for us for 2022. It's not a trial in the sense that we know that Year 7s can operate very well in a high school environment, and they do in other states, they do in other systems, and indeed they do in the very many South Australian public schools that already have Year 7s in a high school environment. We've got a couple of 7 to 12 schools, we've got a number of R to 12 schools and area schools where the Year 7s are already in that secondary school environment, and they do very well. These 3 pilot schools are really important, though, to help us nail the transition to high school correctly. The transition out of primary school of 2 classes, the transition into high school of 2 classes at the same time, and that's why we're very excited that the pilots have not just met what we thought we needed, but also demonstrate significant excitement in those communities.
Member for Wright.
Chair. Minister, if I could just return to Budget Paper 4, Volume 1, page 169, and seeking some clarification about your answers regarding Golden Grove High School in particular. Am I right in saying that the advice you received from your agency is that Golden Grove High School is not as restricted in terms of its ability to be able to expand out as a school like Brighton Secondary College is, and that it's upon that advice largely that the amount of money in this budget paper that has been allocated has been allocated?
The member's question, I think I understand. The amounts of money that were allocated for specific projects were based on departmental advice as to what was necessary, and those announcements were made earlier this year. The member for King, Ms Paula Luthen, asked me several weeks ago after a discussion with, I think, possibly the principal or members of the Governing Council at Golden Grove High School, whether that was going to be sufficient, because there was a suggestion that the land at Golden Grove High School, or the layout, was not too dissimilar to that at Glenunga, where there is also the funding is based on a more complex build than the allocation at Golden Grove. And so I sought further advice from the department and tested it. I think we even may have interrupted Ross Treadwell on his holidays, but we certainly interrogated the department and sought further advice and asked for them to provide further advice. And at this stage, the advice I have from the department has been consistent throughout, that the build at Golden Grove is not of that level of complexity that we see at Brighton and Glenunga, and I'll just check if that's still the case. Yes, and I just add the further point that there is some flex in the Golden Grove and those other schools that are part of the $56 million announcement, because that announcement was tied to numbers of students that were expanding, so there is a possibility it may go up, and the member has quoted the $3.5 million of that $56 million that's expected to be needed to form part of that, and if there is a little bit of flex there, but otherwise the department's advice has been consistent.
Thank you. Same budget paper again. So am I right in saying that you've done some modelling which has informed the amount of money which is forecast to be spent on the increased capacity at Golden Grove High School, but no work has been done to identify where those additional classrooms to accommodate 380 extra Year 7 students will actually go on the site?
No, that's not exactly what I said. The preliminary advice from the the advice from the department drove the allocation of budget and the work on where those classrooms might be and what new buildings are required and what nature they are and what are going to be specialist learning areas as well, which means science labs or performance rooms or other things that will be available beyond the general learning areas. That work is underway at the moment. And when the scope of the project is and the detail are announced, then they will be announced.
Same budget paper, same budget line. Minister, can you rule out that those new classrooms will go on existing ovals at Golden Grove High School?
We're certainly not looking to reduce oval space, and I think that's one of the reasons I identified earlier for the complexity of the build at some other schools. But the project scoping may suggest alternative layouts. I'm not anticipating that being the case at Golden Grove, but I can't rule out any specific detail. We're certainly looking to keep the ovals intact as they are, wherever that's possible.
Thank you. Just one more question on that page that the member for Wright was asking. In planning where students attend school, there is both the knowledge of the zones, but there's also the knowledge of where existing students are coming from. And as was noted, has been noted many times, there are students who go to schools for which they're not zoned. When I was involved with the department, we had star maps. Can the Minister confirm that star maps are still being used to understand where students are coming from to attend school if they're not in the zone?
I'm advised that there's a range of tools that are used. I'm advised that star maps weren't specifically used in the preparation of advice in relation to this project.
Sorry, I probably expressed it badly. What I mean is, do they exist? Are there star maps for schools? Not necessarily being used for this specifically, but do they exist within the department as one of the ways in which you understand where students live versus where they go to school?
I'll take that on notice.
Thank you.
Nicole.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I have a question for the Minister on Budget Paper 4, Volume 1, page 175, Expenses. Minister, one of the Liberal Party's election commitments was to support an expansion of the breakfast programs in our schools. Can you advise how this is going?
Look, I thank the member for McKillop for this question. It's critically important that as we seek to improve our schools, help every child to fulfil their potential, we focus on literacy and academic outcome, but to do that we also need to ensure that their well-being is strong and supported as well. So the school breakfast program was a critically important component of our literacy guarantee election promise, as the member would remember, recognising that children who arrive at school hungry have significant challenges, and behavioural and learning outcomes can be compromised, and I mean, any member of the community would be aware that it's difficult to fulfil your day and be your best when you're hungry, and that's so, even more so for school students. And it doesn't just impact necessarily on the student themselves, but potentially on those around them in their classes, their teachers. Their behavioural challenges can be exacerbated by hunger. And so that's why we thought that it was important to look at this area. Now, there's a lot of great work that goes on in our schools through the staff at schools existing. The wellbeing officers that were introduced in the last few years have a significant role to play. Charities, local churches, a lot of these people do work in schools and have done for many years. And I think there are more than 300 schools that had pre-existing breakfast programs, but there was still opportunity to expand those, and there were schools as well that did not have a breakfast program that wanted one. Some of the schools that did have a breakfast program were potentially 1 or 2 or 3 days a week, and some of them wanted to expand it too. So the funding that we've provided, which is $800,000 now over a 4-year period, is to Food Bank and Kickstart for Kids, $100,000 each per year. That is provided to ensure that every school that needs a breakfast program can have one, that every school that has a breakfast program can have one to its full capacity. The new funding has already been the catalyst for the program to commence in more than 30 new schools over and above those that were doing it before. And as I said before, we're also working with schools to ensure that they are able to offer those programs on as many days as they like. The funding also does something that's also important that I hadn't appreciated until we were actually talking to Food Bank and Kickstart for Kids about rolling out the program. That is, it can guarantee the supply of food, because while by and large the food is donated, and these are significant charities in South Australia, well-supported charities in South Australia, that were able to do lots and lots of good work without this funding beforehand. They can do more with it, can expand the programs with it, but critically it means that at those times where, whether through drought conditions or severe economic downturn, there is a loss in donations, and there have been times when this has happened, these programs can now guarantee supply to schools so that they can plan their programs going forward without any anxiety that if the program donations drop off, if the charity donations drop off, they might have to drop the services offered, which would be a terrible thing for any of those volunteers to have to worry about. So they no longer have to worry about that as a result of the government support. In addition to improving the physical health benefits in children, school breakfast programs also have a great ability to assist social and emotional well-being, because it's not just in classes that these students are able to engage better when they're not hungry. The breakfast programs also enable us to intervene in some of these situations, to give them extra support, to help them get along in social situations, to have them sitting at a table with other students and adults sharing a meal together, which unfortunately is not an experience that is otherwise available in some of their lives. So being able to engage with the charities to do that work is important. It's complementary to other initiatives in the department that support healthy eating in schools more broadly, including in the classroom and canteen context. The most significant of these include funding that's been provided for the South Australian School Canteen Network to support capacity building across the canteen sector, a public health partnership agreement with the Department of Health and Wellbeing that focuses on updating the Right Bite healthy food and drink supply strategy, building skills and capacity of school-based staff and volunteers, coordinating and streamlining online resources available from each department. We also have the COAG Joint Statement and Good Practice Guide for Healthy Eating in Schools, which the Ministerial Council, the Education Council, looked at not so long ago, and we reflected on some of the initiatives there that are already being taken up in South Australian schools, but we also reflected on what else we had to learn from it, as well as membership of the Vegetable Intake Strategy Alliance, with the handy acronym of VISA, which includes the CSIRO, Flinders Uni, Hort Innovation and the Department of Health and Wellbeing. Look, the fact is kids who are hungry don't learn as well as kids who aren't hungry, and we want to make sure that we can do what we can to support those students as they're in our schools.
If we can turn to page 177, with the number of students towards the bottom and students with disabilities, I have some questions that relate to the experience of students with disabilities in our public schools. In the northern suburbs, when looking at special options, so whether being in a special class, a disability unit or in a special school, at the secondary level in the northern suburbs region, how many applications are there that were eligible for special options versus how many places for next year?
I'll probably take that on notice in a moment, but with the member's indulgence, I can actually provide an answer to the member for Wright's previous question in relation to the Golden Grove High School Oval. I've received advice from the department. The work that they're doing is that there is no plan to build on Golden Grove High School's oval. And I'll take the member's question on notice.
I would also like that for the junior then. Thank you.
Happy to take that on notice.
When the Ages and Stages questionnaire was sent out to assist in identifying students that were eligible for special options, has the Minister received any feedback from staff in the schools about the rollout of that, the time that was given and the amount of training that was given for using it?
Look, I apologise. Could you repeat the question? The ages and...
Yeah, so there's a questionnaire that teachers can fill out on ages and stages, so are the students at the stage that they ought to be roughly for the age that they are? And I'm wondering if the Minister's received any information or feedback from any of the schools about the way in which that was rolled out, particularly in the northern suburbs.
Out of an abundance of caution, we'll check, and I'll check if any feedback was provided and to me or the department, and I'll take that on notice.
Still on the subject of students with a disability, the IESP, the panel, can the Minister explain who's on that panel and roughly what their qualifications or job titles are?
I'll endeavour to get that by the end of the session, but for the moment I'll take it on notice, and if I can if I can answer it before the end of the session, then we'll do so.
Can the Minister confirm that schools were told that students who were eligible for special options but were unable to have a placement for this year in a special option and therefore were being taught in mainstream, can the Minister confirm that schools were told that they would get a blanket Category 5 level of support in the mainstream classroom if they'd been eligible for a special class, and a Category 8 if they were eligible for a unit or a school?
Look, that sounds like a fairly detailed suggestion, so again, out of an abundance of caution, I could provide general information, take up some time, but I'd rather get to the nub of the member's question and answer it accurately, so I'll take it on notice.
The Minister's not inclined to take advice to see if anyone with him might know.
Well, do you want to repeat the question so I can make sure that we get it exactly accurately correct?
So were schools this year told that they would receive a Category 5 support in mainstream class for students who were eligible for special classes but in mainstream, and a Category 8 support if eligible for a unit or school but placed in mainstream?
Look, again, I will take that on notice, but to assist the member, I will bring back an answer before the end of the session if we can get that level of detail before the end of the session. We've still got an hour, so there's a reasonable chance.
Indeed. So the subsequent question then is, can you confirm that they were told that, and then that later that decision was rescinded and an assessment student by student had to be undertaken? So I assume that's all bound up, so take that on notice and see how you go within the hour or later if necessary. The funding model for disability support that changed beginning of this year? Yep. Not last year, yes. How many students had reduced support as a result of that? Did any students lose disability support altogether as a result? And presumably for being on notice, if there were students in those categories, at which schools were they attending?
We'll double-check the detail, but our belief at the table, at least, is that it wouldn't have seen students lose. There are, of course, sometimes students who get an assessment in the normal course of things, and that's as it has ever been, so it wouldn't be as a result of the change in the funding model. We think that more students are covered now, but again, the person with the specific detailed knowledge isn't in the room, so we'll double check, and if we can bring back a detailed answer before the end of the session, we will. Otherwise, I will take it on notice.
Thank you. Also, still on the subject of students with disabilities, clearly the point of transition from school to hopefully post-school work or training is a very important one. Can the Minister advise how many students are in transition programs, and how many have been in those programs in the last, say, 3 years, and how many have been successful to go on to training or to work from those programs over the last of 3 years?
I don't think the member will be surprised for that level of detail. I'm going to take that on notice.
I understand. Thank you, and I appreciate that.
Yes,
sorry, can I actually provide some information to one of the earlier answers, which is that there was a feedback session. The member asked about feedback on the rollout. There was a feedback session that we organised involving preschool directors and school leaders, held on the 10th of April to garner feedback regarding the implementation of the IESP initiative, and that was because we wanted to know how people were finding it. Leaders at that session were largely positive. They provided valuable information in relation to what was working well and what was presenting as challenging for some, and certainly we have endeavoured and are endeavouring to ensure that where there are things that have been challenging, that we can fix them.
Thank you. Mine too is in relation to special needs and disabilities. So I refer to Budget Paper 4, Volume 1, pages 174 to 177. The Minister will recall previous estimates. I questioned the closure of Strathmont Swimming Pool and the impact it was going to have on students. At the time, my understanding was there were 15 schools with more than 450 students that were going to be impacted by the closure of that pool and be relocated to other pools. So my question is, since the closure of the Strathmont pool, what has been the reduction in the number of hours to swimming therapy access or swimming lessons over the school year for these special needs students?
I can provide some information to the member. So the Strathmont Centre swimming pool closed at the end of January 2019. The Strathmont Centre was operated by the Department of Human Services, and the Department of Education had access to the swimming pool for a number of years to provide students with disability at a number of schools access to the facilities at no cost. Pardon me, but obviously the swimming pool was closed as it was no longer deemed as fit for purpose, and there was some, I'm aware of some safety concerns that I think were described. Alternative arrangements have been made for the 15 schools and the 452 students impacted by the closure regarding their water safety program for the 2019 school year. The majority of these schools have elected to access the Parks Recreation and Sports Centre, with the remaining schools accessing Clovercrest State Swimming Pool, and I think 2 schools are accessing the Golden Grove State Swimming Pool. Some schools have made a decision to vary the level of their access for some or all of the students who were previously accessing Strathmont. The cost varies for each school. The cost impact varies for each school, but may include an increase in the cost of travel due to changes in distance between the school and the new swimming pool and the cost of pool entry. The Strathmont Centre was one of only 3 swimming pools where there has been traditionally no pool entry cost for students with disabilities. Most of the pools used for students with disabilities for a number of years don't have that feature. The majority of students with disabilities attending government schools accessing a regular weekly program pay a school pool entry fee ranging from approximately $3 to $4.50. A temporary subsidy of the new pool entry costs has been approved by the Department for Education in relation to students who were previously accessing the Strathmont swimming pool, to ensure that each of those students will pay no more than $2 a session in 2019, and the annual cost to the department is estimated for that to be $38,000. The Office for Recreation, Sport and Racing has funded the installation of 4 new automatic doors at the Parks Recreation and Sports Centre change rooms in line with disability access requirements to support the needs of these students and indeed anyone else accessing those facilities with a disability. The Department for Education is funding the installation of 4 overhead lifters or hoists in the change rooms at the Parks Recreation and Sports Centre to be used by students with disabilities. There was a delay in the installation of the hoists due to supply issues with the overseas manufacturer, and at the time that the advice was provided to me, this was due to occur between the 19th and 22nd of June, so I'm hoping those hoists are now in place. And with the closure of Strathmont, existing specialised equipment was sourced from a range of places, moved to the parks to ensure the water safety program can continue to take place for students with disability prior to the new specialised equipment being permanently installed in the middle of this year. So the new program for students with disabilities commenced at the parks on the 4th of February. Programs at the other swimming centres commenced the following week, and the instructor in charge of the water safety program at the parks has indicated that facilities at the parks are significantly better than the Strathmont Centre swimming pool, and this will deliver greater educational outcomes in water safety for all involved.
Thank you for that information, Minister. I was aware of a lot of that as it is. In relation to the flow-on cost to schools and to parents, would you be able to provide information specifically regarding the cost of travel for transport, including the cost of bus hire and taxi for the students to get to pools that in some cases half an hour from where their school is? So it means that it's an hour of travel there and back, so they're missing out on lesson time as well. The other question that I have, and specifically the number of hours that have been reduced. So I would like to know the number of hours that these special needs students have had reduced as a result of the closure of the Strathmore pool and them having to be relocated elsewhere. In addition to that, and you just made a comment from the swimming person in charge of swimming in the swimming pools there, specifically the access to the pool. So at Strathmont, these special needs students, many who had sensory issues relating to spatial awareness and also to the noise surrounding them, what is the current situation at the swimming pools that they're attending? And do they have the equal amount of swimming pool space? So my understanding is that in some cases they're restricted to 2 lanes, whereas previously they had a full swimming pool for their lessons.
I will look into these matters and I'll provide some information to the member.
Thank you, Minister.
Or who wants to call? Member for Port Adelaide.
Thank you. I'd like now to turn to page 187 of Budget Paper 4, Volume 1, which looks at describing some of the variances in the figures. One, about a third of the way down, refers to the impact of efficiency measures of $21.6 million. Can the Minister describe what work ceased as a result of achieving those efficiency measures?
Well, there were a range of things that happened. I can advise the member that my office manager tells me that the Minister for Education's office came in about $500,000 under budget, which of course is a substantial saving to the taxpayers of South Australia and assists the Education Department in its savings measures. We also no longer have 7 outposted staff from the Education Department doing roles in the Minister for Education's office as occurred under the previous government. So that helped. There's a range of things that were done. Hang on a second. Salary harvesting is one of those measures.
Can the Minister decipher salary harvesting, please?
Sorry?
Can the Minister explain what salary harvesting is for the listeners?
Well, salary harvesting has been explained earlier. It's something the Education Department has done. It's in relation to when a role ceases and before the replacement is necessarily taken on board in a department as large as the Education Department that is able to assist us in our goal.
I don't regard that as a comprehensive description of the work that ceased to achieve $21.6 million. Would the Minister like to try to give a bit more of a description? So which positions were harvested, for example, which TVSPs were offered, where were those TVSPs, where was the non-renewal of contracts occurring, what work is not now happening as a result? $21.6 million is reasonably substantial and
Sorry,
it can't
which
just
question would you like me to answer?
Well, I'm trying to give you an understanding of what, when I say what work ceased to achieve the $21.6 million, what I mean by that. What work ceased? What stopped?
Well, we no longer have 2 communications officers from the Education Department posted in the Minister's office, so that helped. They're reasonably well remunerated.
Yeah.
It's not the full extent of the savings. We also had, of course, some opportunities. I'm not sure if it was, I think it was in this financial year where we cancelled the former government's laptop giveaway program. That saved a lot more than that, I would have thought. There were some TVSPs which were around 200 full-time equivalent staff. They were non-teaching and non-direct support staff. There were 2 rounds of expressions of interest for a TVSP. There was an organisational restructure. And the process was developed considering feedback from employees, and it was designed to maximise employee choice. A range of stakeholders were engaged throughout that process. And I think that the work that the Education Department is doing is focused on ensuring that we are able to deliver great outcomes for our students. And the savings that are made in these areas, of course, are all being reapplied in education.
Could the Minister provide the list of position titles for those people who received TVSPs in the last financial year? On notice, I'm assuming, as there were several of them.
I will endeavour to find out whatever we can to do, to release to the member, and whatever is appropriate to release, we will do so.
Can the Minister give a list of the areas in the department that had TVSPs given to staff?
I'll take that as part of the previous question taken on notice.
Were any people employed into the department and taking up a position with the same title as a person who'd received a TVSP?
No, there was as part.
Unless there's a
I'm advised that people were not replaced. Some people left, some people came into the department. I'm advised that the people coming into the department were not coming in to replace roles that were abolished. If there are any variances from that, obviously we'll provide that information, but that certainly wasn't
only in the Environment Department.
Sorry?
Only in the Environment Department.
That's certainly not something that I was led to believe was happening. It's certainly not something we understand has happened.
How much was spent on refurbishing the Level 9 offices for the Minister, and how much of that was investing versus operating?
The changes in the office out of the ministerial office budget, which, as I say, we came in about $500,000 under budget last year. There were some health and safety issues in one of the staff offices. I think there might have been some new chairs. There was some new paint. I don't think we have the exact number here, but it was in the order of a couple $1,000s.
So there's been no refurbishment otherwise of the Minister's office?
There was, more recently, there was a dividing area removed. And oh, that's right, yes, because it was apparently there was a problem with the air conditioning. So again, we're talking in the order of several $1,000s, and I think that it was, extremely modest in the scale of things. Well, I think I've still got your old chair. Somebody,
sure, I didn't create too much of a dent in it.
Somebody from your office was obviously kind enough to leave one of your old staffing profiles with all of those extra people listed above the FTE count in the budget papers. That was kind of them. We've still got. There is a bar fridge in the Minister for Education's office. It doesn't work.
Is it still dysfunctional? Yeah, it didn't work throughout my time.
We haven't bothered
Didn't
moving
need it.
It's sort of a historical relic. Sits
That's
alongside the minutes of.
Second.
I think it was some very, very minor works done for staff health reasons, certainly nothing fancy, and I'm happy to have the minister, the former minister, come back and have a look any time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Speaking of expenses, my question is in regards to Budget Paper 4, Volume 1, page 175. Can the Minister advise what steps the government is taking to enhance physical education and physical literacy in our schools?
Thank you, and it's a real honour for me to get a question of this nature from somebody of the member for Colton's extraordinary stature, and I appreciate the work he does in his local schools to use his prior career as Australia's most decorated Paralympian and one of our most decorated sports people to inspire young people in their physical education and physical literacy. This is something I know the Chief Executive of the Department is really excited about, and so if I miss anything out, I'm sure he'll nudge me and get the opportunity to say something about it as well. But it was a real pleasure on Sunday the 9th of June to be able to announce that what we've called the PEPL initiative, which stands for Physical Education and Physical Literacy, was going to be able to go ahead, as certainly in pilot form. This was developed by Professor Dick Telford of Canberra University, along with some partners, aiming to promote children's physical activity, teachers' capacity in delivering physical education, and linking students with community sporting opportunities. It's something we've been working on very strongly with the Australian Council for Health, Physical Education and Recreation, which is the body in South Australia that is the professional organisation, if you like, for health and PE teachers. And it was an absolute thrill to be able to attend their conference in the school holidays. Unfortunately, it was just before we made this announcement, so I wasn't able to tell them all at the time, but I've subsequently learned that they're very excited about it. The approach involves the placement of an experienced health and PE trained teacher as a PEPL coach in a cluster of 8 to 10 schools to provide personalised and flexible in-class professional development for HP and classroom teachers. Approximately 4,000 students from years 3 and 5 in up to 30 primary schools will participate in PEPL in 2020. HPE lessons will increase from 1 lesson to 2 lessons per week, and teachers will be supported to incorporate regular activity snacks. Activity snacks should be in quotation marks. That's what they're called in the program. Apparently it gets the kids interested. And activity snacks of vigorous activity between periods of in-class concentration. Supplementing the HPE lessons, state sporting organisations will also deliver coaching clinics to students to build their fundamental movement skills. The Department for Education partnered with Professor Telford, ACHPA, the Professional Association for Teachers I identified before, the University of Canberra, Hockey Australia and Flinders University to submit the PEPL proposal to the Move It Oz Participation Grant Program, which is run by Sport Australia, the national body. Sport Australia will provide $700,000 to Hockey Australia, the lead agency in the funding application, to fund the PEPL initiative from June 2019 to December 2020. And in addition to that, as an in-kind contribution, the Department for Education will provide 1 FTE, a project manager with on-costs worth over $150,000 in in-kind support. And we will, as out of the $700,000, we will also benefit from $362,000 into the department to employ those 3 FTE educators for 12 months. They'll be overseen by the project manager. So we're very excited about this. The initiative will be evaluated by Flinders University, reporting on PEPL as a proof of concept initiative, and if it's successful, then we'll be certainly looking it out to roll it out more broadly across the state. Was there anything that the Chief Executive... No, is you happy with that? Okay.
Member for Wright is very enthusiastic.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, refer to Budget Paper 4, Volume 1, page 187. I think in your opening statement you touched briefly upon the Incident Management Directorate, as you referred to it, and an FTE who had been moved from there.
I didn't think I had an opening statement.
It might have been your answer to an earlier question.
Okay.
Let's call it that.
Yep.
Can you tell us a little bit about what that FTE who is no longer in the IMD was doing and how that person's function has been absorbed?
I might ask the Chief Operating Officer to provide her reflections as it's in her area.
The position, the role and the person simply transferred from the Incident Management Directorate to the People and Culture Division with no change. The role is supporting principals with minor misconduct matters. There were, but not in that position.
So that was the position that was moved. You were interested also in the ones that were no longer required, or...?
Yes, that's right.
I'll invite the Chief Operating Officer again to respond to that.
There were 2 positions that were abolished within the Directorate. One was a case manager position, and that was based on the number of cases being managed currently by the Directorate in comparison to the number that were being managed at the time that the position was created. So it just led to the fact that we didn't require that position. The other was an administrative officer position, and the Directorate combined all of their administration together to make efficiencies.
Same budget line. Does the department monitor the average time it takes to complete investigations, or the average time it takes the IMD to complete its investigations?
So yes is the answer. There is a target that matters be resolved in 6 months, and my advice has been, since I've been the Minister fairly consistently, that that target is being met unless there are specific circumstances, and usually that would be court matters being awaited to be resolved. Let me just check. Let's say court matters or other matters of a legal nature.
Same budget line again. My understanding of your earlier answer is that we've seen removed from the Directorate a case manager position, an admin position, and another position that has been moved into the people and culture area.
Yep.
I understand that the consultation that was done on the restructure of incident management sought feedback from staff, and some of the feedback that was raised were concerns about the potential for workload issues to arise as a result of the proposed changes. So can I ask, how has that been addressed, given that we've got 3 fewer FTEs in that division than before the changes were proposed?
So, in relation to those 3 positions, the answers are nuanced for each of the 3. The one that was the staff member that was moved to People and Culture also took their responsibilities with them. So, in as much as, yes, there was a reduction in that FTE from the Directorate, the responsibilities of the Directorate were also transferred, well, of that staff member were also transferred with the staff. So they took their workload with them. In relation to the 2 positions that were removed, the case manager position that was no longer required was as a result of a reduction in the number of cases, as I'm advised, and so that had a corresponding reduction in the workload that made that possible. And in relation to the administrative officer, my understanding is that there were systems improvements in the administration there that have meant that the workload capacity has been able to be managed, and as I'm advised, that's working out just fine.
Yvonne has a question. She's been waiting patiently.
Minister, there doesn't appear to be additional funding for Avenues College in the budget, and
Age and reference you're looking at.
budget paper 4, volume 1, page 189.
Thank you.
And you could go 169 as well. So there doesn't appear to be additional funding in the budget for Avenues College, and I know as it's getting closer to the relocation of the primary school onto the site for the beginning of next year, I believe, that there is an increased interest in student enrolment at the school, and I'm wanting to know how the Minister is what the Minister is going to do to assist with capacity management at the new Birth to 12 college.
So Avenues College obviously has had a voluntary amalgamation process, and that determined a certain amount of funding that would be available for an infrastructure bill to start with. In addition to that, since coming to government, the new government has provided extra money in the budget to assist that to be a larger build. I appreciate that the school council chair has asked for more than that extra, and that I advise that the advice I've had from the Education Department is that with the extra money that the new government has provided, that will enable the new build to be sufficient for the school, and it'll be an excellent new build. With new students comes new money as a general course as a result of the Education Department's funding model. The number of students impacts on the funding the school gets. So as Avenues College has an increased number of students, so too will its budget increase. And my advice is that new funding as part of the Year 7 project wasn't required over and above what the Avenues College already has to enable Year 7s to come in. Obviously there were some that were going to be there already, but potentially that will increase, but not by a substantial number.
In response to that, the money that comes in for students is not in relation to the building, the infrastructure. We're talking about being able to accommodate the new interest in this amalgamated school on the campus site. So you're saying now that there will be no additional money for Avenues College for the as it becomes a birth to 12 school?
My advice is that it's not necessary, and from what we can observe at this stage, I have great confidence in the teaching and the learning that's going on at Avenues College, and I am a huge champion for when people ask me about their local schools. I like to point out the wonderful work that's going on there, and so I really hope that people respond in the way that the member is suggesting they do and fill up Avenues College, and I hope that all of these classrooms are used to their capacity. I think it'll be a wonderful education institution when it's completed, the new build is completed. I think it's a wonderful education institution now, and I really hope that the member is correct that those numbers there continue to increase. Because that would be a lovely challenge for us to have.
With an increase in numbers, though, will there be additional funding? Is additional funding available to ensure that the students in the area that want to come to Avenues College are able to do so?
Look, the question clearly is hypothetical. We base our decisions as a government around doing everything we can to ensure that our schools are world class, to ensure that children in local areas are able to be guaranteed a space at their local public school, and then we have matters to do with building infrastructure that helps that. In some areas where there's particularly high levels of interest and it's difficult sometimes to build that extra infrastructure, then we've had to support schools to enforce their zones or even enforce capacity management plans. And to this stage, Avenues College hasn't been listed as one of those schools that's going to require that mechanism to take place. I think that kids who go to Avenues College are getting a great education, and I'm really excited to see what the school's going to do in the years ahead, and I thank the teachers and the staff there, the Governing Council for supporting it. But the advice I've had is at this stage there's no extra capital works funding that is required to meet the school's needs, and you know, in the years ahead, if there is shown to be new advice, then obviously the government will take that into account.
Thank you, Minister. We agree on one thing. It is a wonderful school.
I also said that it will continue to be a wonderful school and it will get even better, and I hope we agree on that too.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, Budget Paper 4, Volume 1, page 187. In an answer to a previous question, I asked about whether your agency monitors the time it takes to complete investigations in the Incident Management Directorate. I think you mentioned in your answer that there was a target of 6 months. Has that time frame or target been met in all cases since you've been the Minister?
Well, I said there was a target of 6 months, and I then went on to say that there were a number of exceptions to that, where there were, and as far as I'm aware, they're all to do with court or other legal-related matters. Some of those are obviously in court and are publicly available. Some of them are not so readily describable.
So it's the same budget line, so the answer is no, is that right? It was a pretty
I
straightforward question.
think I've answered this question twice now.
I think you've answered it once.
The target is 6 months, and where we're able to do so, absent instruction from any other legal-related entities, such as courts, then my understanding is we're achieving that.
Same budget line again, Minister. How many investigations were conducted by the Directorate in the last financial year, and how does that compare to 2 years before it, let's say?
I'll take that on notice.
From Budget Paper 4, Volume 1, page 175, targets, second dot point from the bottom. Minister, what is the government doing to improve school attendance rates?
Look, I thank the member for this question, and it's obviously critically important for all of our children in order to achieve their best and be their best selves, to have successful lives and get the best possible education, that they be at school to receive that education. And I know that this is something that has been a challenge for successive governments and will continue to be a challenge in the future, because often there are circumstances in the home that significantly impact on this. But that doesn't relieve us of a responsibility as a system to do everything we can to get the best attendance possible. And that's been something that was a commitment of the new government coming in. It was something that was a commitment in the couple of years leading up to the election. And I was pleased during that period to see a renewed emphasis on some of these measures by the former government. And I thank the member for Port Adelaide for taking a couple of steps when she was the minister. I'll probably come to in a moment. But nevertheless, we have taken significant further steps over the last 16 months since the Liberal Party was elected. So the government's commitment to addressing attendance outlined a range of strategies for schools and ways to work with parents. We, early on after coming to government, we completed an audit of all public schools' compliance and adherence with departmental attendance policy requirements. We completed an audit of all children and young people in care who are on reduced hours of attendance at school, and we've taken steps to re-engage them in mainstream education as recommended by Justice Nyland. We've increased the number of Department for Education truancy officers by 50%, or 11 FTE, taking the total number of positions up to 33 FTEs to support truancy and attendance issues across government and non-government schools. The Department's attendance matters in South Australian preschools and schools document outlines a whole school approach to attendance, which includes the promotion of importance of education from the earliest years, by supporting families to understand the importance of education and positive patterns of attendance, the active engagement of children, young people and their families in education, and strategies to address barriers to attendance, such as monitoring attendance patterns, taking early action on attendance concerns and addressing chronic non-attendance. Current initiatives underway at the moment under Attendance Matters include a parent-targeted social media pilot campaign with the message "Every day missed is a barrier to learning." That campaign's been released to the Inner West and to the Port Augusta Corn partnerships in week 3 of term 2 this year, at a cost of approximately $96,000 for market research, materials and, critically, evaluation, because we want to make sure that the messaging we're putting out is going to be effective and will speak to parents, will speak to students and will help us achieve our goals. There's also a partnership with the Youth Affairs Council of South Australia, which I think was in discussion for some time, but we were able to get that locked in. That provides a youth voice on attendance improvement. So they've been funded for $200,000 over 2 years to develop a peer education bullying prevention initiatives, which is part of our bullying prevention strategy but has a critical role in attendance. Also to review current policies and procedures relating to attendance, for a trial of family group conferencing model for chronic non-attendance, which has commenced, and systems to support schools to monitor student attendance, and resources to support schools to implement policy and improve attendance. The Department's drafted a new attendance policy which underlines the responsibilities of all members of the school community to ensure children and young people are attending school. Public consultation on the policy ended recently, and the final policy will be released in term 3. And as a response to the Child Protection System Royal Commission, a second audit of children and young people in care on reduced hours of attendance is currently underway as well. We have committed to enforcing the powers under the sections of the Education Act in relation to parents who make no attempt to keep their children in school or who obstruct officers in identifying their children as truant. and I thank the former member for taking this on in the last couple of years Labor was in office and bringing 2 prosecutions to the fore, which I think had an important role in highlighting public awareness, highlighting the fact that the existing laws, while potentially they could be improved, were indeed adequate to bring a prosecution, a successful prosecution, and to ensure and highlight to both the families of those children involved who have spent a lot more time at school since those prosecutions than they were before, but also to others in that situation that they could be prosecuted. Prosecution of a parent is only considered in case where it's determined by the department to be in the best interest of the child, where all other interventions have been unsuccessful and where fair warnings have been provided, and those are reasonable measures, and then it comes to the Minister for approval. And of course, further, under the Education Children's Services Bill, which is currently, I'm not sure if I can talk about it, it's between the houses, so let's say I can briefly reflect on it. We're proposing to increase the maximum fine for parents who allow their children to be chronically truant, and for those hindering or obstructing others in identifying children and young people not at school. It also includes the power to cause a family group conference to address a child's non-attendance at school, and the trial of the family group conferencing model will inform how this is implemented. Those are some fairly substantial and important improvements to the legislation. I'm really pleased that as that legislation has gone to a conference of managers of the houses, all of those aspects that I've just talked about in relation to assisting our management of truancy and non-attendance have remained intact through the consideration of the bill. So as long as we can sort out those 3 last little bits, hopefully next Wednesday or at any time thereafter, then this will be the law going forward, which will dramatically enhance our ability to provide both at the beginning a supportive mechanism through family group conferencing, but also strengthen the stick to ensure that parents are engaging where they've previously chosen not to. So I thank the opposition and all of the other parties who sit in this Red House for allowing for showing their support for these measures in that bill, which will help our work.
To turn to page 167 of Paper 4, Volume 1, there's a reference to programs moving to human services. 231 people, FTE, although there'd been an and previously, the year before that, 200 people, 199.8 FTE. Can the Minister explain which staff have moved over to human services? What the grouping of titles doesn't need to be title by title.
I think the simplest thing is to provide the information I have here, which I think answers all of those questions, and then you can let me know if we've fallen short. So the government has developed a child and family intensive support system, which includes a transfer of a range of services and programs to the Department of Human Services from other agencies for reporting. A total of 231.3 FTE and $337.3 million in budget from the Department for Education has been transferred to DHS to support the delivery of the functions and programs identified. The services and programs transferred are to include all associated funding, staff, management, clinical governance and resources to support the implementation of the new system through the creation of the new intensive support unit within DHS. The transfer of the following functions and programs from the Department for Education to DHS came into effect from the 1st of July. The Child and Family Assessment and Referral Networks, known colloquially as CFANs, the Child Wellbeing Program, Family Practitioners, Community Development Coordinators, Strong Start, Parenting and Family Support Programs, the Targeted Intervention Service, known slightly less colloquially as TIS, Family by Family, a Grant to Playgroups SA, the Child Safe Environments, strategic projects, I'll describe, the dot point describes it as strategic projects / Nyland Royal Commission, which I assume is in relation to a response to recommendations in the Nyland Royal Commission, and the education functions of the Multi-Agency Protection Service and the Multi-Agency Assessment Unit. Community development coordinators and family practitioners will remain located within Department for Education Children's Centres. However, the staff will transfer to DHS for their line management, changing from Children's Centres directors to senior family practitioners and senior community development coordinators as part of the transfer to DHS. The Child and Family Intensive Support System will support greater collaboration and integration between services across government and will consolidate services and staff as part of the redesign of the state's child abuse and neglect early intervention and prevention system. Currently, service provision and funding for intensive family services is split across different government departments, including education, health and child protection. Transfer of employees from the Department for Education to DHS will be published, or possibly was published, by notice in the Gazette pursuant to Section 9 of the Public Sector Act 2009. The instrument of delegation via a 2011 Machinery of Government that had replicated responsibilities and functions for the Child and Family Health Service from the Minister for Health and Wellbeing to the Minister for Education Child Development, I believe has been revoked, and if it hasn't been, we certainly will, but I'm informed now that it has been.
So I will ask questions in the early childhood section about some of the changes that have been made that affect early childhood services, but with the wellbeing practitioners, there were 70-odd in March of last year. They were located with schools. Has their reporting line changed away from the Department of Education and into the Department for Human Services?
Yes, I think technically there is a reporting line that goes to DHS, but in effect their jobs are largely as they were before, and they're still working very closely with the principals. I think that if there's any further information that will assist in a fuller understanding of that, then I'll bring it back. But effectively, yes, the reporting line has moved to DHS, as I'm advised. But in practice, I don't believe that we've seen any substantial change to the roles they do or the ways in which they do it.
What commitment is there from the Department for Human Services to the Department for Education about the kind of service delivery that can be expected from the child wellbeing practitioners, and also about their commitment to continue to fund the positions?
Funding is through So we're currently finalising a memorandum of understanding between the two agencies, and that will be, I assume that will be publicly released. We'll check. We'll provide the information in due course, but we're going to lock that in very solidly.
And that's probably an MOU for all of the effort that's been moved across, rather than just for the child wellbeing practitioners?
Look, if there's detail that is in addition to that, I'll happily bring it back.
I'd like to know how much money has been put to support the child wellbeing practitioners from the education budget to the human services budget.
We'll break down the 337 when we bring... I think one of the former questions I've taken on notice, I'm sure we can incorporate it into that answer.
Okay. If we can turn to page 174. Just a quick question. What was the date of the tender for the Internet Speed project that has been updated various times in the last few months?
See what we've got. So we announced it on the 11th of December 2018. I note that Telstra did some work earlier in the year that we talked about last year, I think, to prove up the concept. I think we had that at a very beautiful rate.
It's the tender date I'm interested in.
Yes, I appreciate that. Just seeing if we've got the detail here, if we need to take it on notice and come back. The advice I have was that there were some moves made by the former government in late January 2018. They announced, I suppose the member announced an intention, possibly with the former member for Cheltenham, to invest in internet services across the state aimed at providing speeds 10 times faster on average for all schools and preschools. At the time, it was stated the investment would be tens of millions of dollars, but due to ongoing negotiations, detailed costs were considered commercial in confidence. The final cost was going to be provisioned against future Commonwealth revenue in anticipation of the finalisation of a national agreement. The amount did not form part of the department's approved budget. I'm advised that's because, of course, it is difficult to include in the department's improved budget money coming from the Commonwealth that hasn't been agreed to. I confirmed that I signed the National Schools Funding Agreement at the East Adelaide School with Federal Minister Dan Tehan in the second half of last year. I seem to recall the Shadow Minister saying that was a bad thing at the time, but until that money was available, it couldn't be in the department's budget. In as much as a date on which we dealt with it after Cabinet dealt with it last year, we'll see if we can bring that back before the end of the day, and if we can't, I'll take it on notice. But I'll do my level best to get the answer back today.
Yep, date of tenders would be terrific. Also on that page, there's some references to NAPLAN. I understand that the recent Ministerial Council decided that it wouldn't go for a full rollout next year, that would be deferred again for next year, for the following year. What criteria will the Minister be using for determining how many students have their NAPLAN test done online next year in public schools?
Yeah, well, the key thing that's probably going to inform us is a report that we haven't yet received that was commissioned through the either the officers group through ASOC, commissioned Deloitte to do some extensive work and identify exactly what went wrong, and particularly on the first day of testing. And I think it's fair to say that ministers from across the country, from all states and territories and the Commonwealth, are very eagerly looking forward to that report. It's fair to say that different states had different levels of challenge, and while in South Australia we had a much higher percentage of schools than some of the states that did NAPLAN online, I think we had a much lower level of challenge than some of the other states reported. We had 1,000 students out of more than 200,000 tests that had to resit. And some other states with a lower proportion of schools going online had a higher proportion. I think Tasmania didn't even have that level of... Yeah, they didn't even need to do the reset in Tasmania. So one of the things that came out is that it wasn't necessarily a challenge that was tied to the infrastructure at a state level, but we can't comprehensively state with certainty what went wrong on that first day until Deloitte comes back. And of course the challenges at the school level, some students were locked out and couldn't get back in, some students had significant disruptions, and I think the Chief Executive was in a school where it was a much shorter period of time. Some schools there was a minute or two disruption and everyone was fine. So it's a complex question, and obviously we want the answers, and we're hoping that that report from Deloitte will give us that certainty in the coming weeks. It was a really collaborative discussion in the Ministerial Council. We're not supposed to talk in too much detail about things that happen inside the Council, but the communiqué is there for all to see.
Will that report be made public?
Look, that's a matter for the Ministerial Council, and so I can't unilaterally, on behalf of the 8 other ministers and myself, make that determination. I would certainly suggest that whether the report is made public in full, I'm pretty sure that the findings will be keen to release as quickly as possible, because I think it's whatever the outcomes are of this report, it will both inform the decisions made by ministers, and it will also inform the community and parents and students and teachers about how they will go into the NAPLAN online tests next year. So it's critically important that we get that information, and I'm looking forward to receiving it.
Thank you.
Mr Chairman, my question refers to Budget Paper 4, Volume 1, page 175, Expenses. Supplies and services. Payment on time is critical...
Can you start again? There's a bit of chat over here.
Budget Paper 4, Volume 1, page 175, Expenses, Supplies and Services. Payment on time is critical for viability of suppliers. Could you outline the timeliness of accounts payable?
Yes, thank you. I'm happy to just take a very brief period of time to do this. It's an important point, and I know that the member for McKillop, as somebody who's been involved in different forms of business throughout his life and has a very high level of interest in how we support our small businesses and businesses as a government. And one of the best ways we can do that is by paying our bills on time. And so when we came into government, that was a focus for our new government. I'm pleased to say that the Education Department, I think, has done this pretty well historically, but we always want to do better. So for the 2017-18 financial year, that was the overlap year in which there was an election, 96.92% of invoices, or 103,432 invoices, were paid by the Department for Education within 30 calendar days. 0.42% of invoices, or 410 invoices, were paid greater than 60 days. Today, at the time of this information for the 2018-19 financial year, that had improved. 99.17% of invoices were paid by the department within 30 calendar days, and only 0.08% of invoices were paid greater than 60 days. For the month of May, which is the most recent one for which I've got details, 97.03% of invoices were paid within 30 days, and 0.15% of invoices were paid greater than 60 calendar days, for a total value of less than $2,500. I'm advised by the department that this improvement in payment performance has been directly attributed to the department's increased focus on the timeliness of invoice payments, and that will continue to be a focus for us going forward. We have, obviously, new legislation that punishes the recalcitrant departments, and I'm very pleased to say that while we have been subject to this to a small amount, there have been late payment interest incurred for 11 invoices this financial year. The total up to May 2019 was $378.55. It's not good enough, but we are doing better than before, and we'll continue to strive to do better.
Question for page 174. At the top, there's reference to the National School Reform Agreement that the Minister referred to earlier. Can the Minister, and I expect this will be taken on notice, provide information about how many public schools in South Australia are at 100% of the SRS this year, next year and the year after, anticipated, and how many, and which private schools are at 100% or greater of the SRS this year, next year and the year after?
So in relation to the way that this is worked out, the member is well aware that the requirement is for the State Education Department to get to 75% of SRS, and indeed the Commonwealth will get up to 20% for public schools. In our non-government school sector, there is a third contributing group in addition to the state and Commonwealth government, and that is parents who pay school fees. So because of the parental contribution, the government contribution, combined state and federal for non-government schools, rarely gets close to 100%. In most schools it's substantially less, and the rest is supplemented by parental contribution. There would be some exceptions to that. I'm thinking particularly of special assistance schools and possibly some of our schools with disability. Our schools focused on supporting students with disability, and indeed there's a school called Pinnacle College which supports students at their Golden Grove, Elizabeth, and they've got one other campus, I forget off the top of my head where it is, and they were historically at a higher level. So they may be getting close to 100%. And the Catholic education sector, as the member well knows, is supported 22% of their SRS from the state government as applied to their whole sector, and the Catholic education system can make some further determinations within that. So, given that the Commonwealth Government is heading towards 20% and the state government is heading towards 75%, and to achieve that task, the state government has had to commit an extra $700 million to our public schools over and above that which was provisioned by the Labor Party when it was in government, added money going into the budget over the next decade. I think that that question I've actually been able to answer. I can also answer one of the earlier questions that I know the member for Port Adelaide was very eager to know. I have a date for when the tender went out for internet services to the Across Government Network Carriage Services Panel. It was the 13th of September 2018.
Thank you, Minister. Unless time has expired, there being no further questions, I declare the examination of the proposed payments for the portfolio school education completed. Member for Narunga.
Committee be suspended until 11:45.
Is that seconded?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'll put that at once. The committee suspended until 11:45.